Story 1. As someone who spent 10 years in the Navy, it would be much better to have physical testing based on job rather than on age and sex. The requirements for a Navy sea, air, and land operator do not decrease as an individual gets older, just as the requirements to be a cook do not lessen. However, a Navy sea, air, and land operator and a cook require very different skill sets and should be tested according to their job demands. Story 2. Several years ago, the Army revised its physical training assessment, replacing the Army Physical Fitness Test with the Army Combat Fitness Test. During development, it went through several iterations to determine the appropriate grading system. The original idea was to have gender-neutral, job-based performance requirements. Under that plan, there would be a single grading scale with jobs placed into different categories, heavy, medium, and light, based on the physical demands of the role. Combat arms jobs like infantry and armor would have higher standards than support jobs like communications and supply. As soldiers were promoted, they could move into lower demand categories. For example, as an armor captain, I would have been in the heavy category because I led on the line, but upon promotion to major, I would have moved to the medium category because I would be in a staff role and not expected to lead troops in combat. Ultimately, the plan was shelved because the optics of excluding women from combat arms, since few were meeting the heavy category standards, were politically unacceptable. The Army moved to a system with separate standards for men and women and a sliding scale based on age. That approach ties standards to sex and age rather than to the actual physical requirements of the job. The current proposal is to return to a gender-neutral system that holds combat arms roles to higher physical standards. I understand that may seem discriminatory, but combat arms roles involve life or death situations and should be reserved for those who can meet the harsh physical requirements. That will exclude some women, and it will exclude some men. I have served with many women who meet these standards and many men who do not. I would choose a ranger-qualified woman who can keep up over a less capable man who drops out of ruck marches. It is not about gender. It is about the ability to perform the demanding physical tasks. Gender-neutral requirements for combat arms roles ensure that everyone assigned can meet those demands. Story 3. I was in the Marine Corps Infantry when the first women were integrated around 2016. They started a test that had the same standards across the board for infantry, including a straight buddy drag in full kit, a Mark 19 overhead press, and a wall jump in full kit. This was not the combat fitness test or the physical fitness test. If you were too short to jump the wall, you were done. If you couldn't lug 2 sets of body armor and a 200-pound dummy, you were done. I think this kind of standard is okay. Infantry is about shooting, moving, and dragging your buddies out of danger. If you can do it, let's go. But if you can't drag me out because you are too weak, then no, I don't want you on my side in the trenches. We can be realistic though, fighter pilots, submariners, and mechanics probably won't be in the frontline trenches responsible for dragging my fat ass out of the mud with my shoulder-launched multipurpose assault weapon, so for those jobs, what does it matter? Story 4. If you are a personnel administrator, I do not care how many push-ups you can do. If you are an infantry soldier, I need someone strong enough to drag me to cover. Gender does not matter. Story 5. Age groups have different standards too. Does anyone know if that is going to change? Story 6. I support this policy for ground combat roles such as infantry or special operations, where soldiers and Marines routinely carry more than 100 pounds of weapons, ammunition, and equipment. There should be a single fitness standard for the infantry. Otherwise, the weakest person on a team puts everyone else at increased risk. Male or female does not matter. Physical fitness does. For support roles, physical fitness is less critical. A single test is fine. Scores need not be as high as for the infantry. I served 24 years in the United States Army. Story 7. As far as physical requirements go, I can understand the reasoning behind this move for combat roles. However, I am not a fan of how the military tests for physical readiness. In my experience, the test leans heavily on cardiovascular endurance, which is important for combat readiness, but physical strength is equally important. If my combat partner cannot at least drag me without injuring themselves in the event I am wounded, I would not consider them battle ready. I think the Army's new physical training test was a step in the right direction by adding weighted events and sprints. To hijack this thread a bit, I served as Military Occupational Specialty 27D, paralegal specialist in the Army, And the announcement that the service would be pulling back anonymous reporting and other victim safeguards is a huge problem. Sexual assault and harassment remain a disproportionately large issue in the military because the system is focused on power imbalance. Everyone has someone above and below them in rank. Anonymous reporting is not what it sounds like. You cannot go to your commander, claim someone assaulted you, and demand they be imprisoned without the accused being able to defend themselves. Anonymous reports allow the victim to access sexual assault resources without entering the criminal process. The alleged perpetrator would not be punished unless the victim chose to come forward. Does it suck that fewer women will be in combat roles? Yes. It is worse that more women and men will be raped and assaulted and will have to choose between telling everyone about the worst thing that happened to them or not receiving any help. Story 8. Do you know why the standards were lowered? You might think diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? No, it was enrollment numbers. The United States military cannot find enough physically fit men and women to fill the ranks. Unless the government intends to address the country's obesity problem, this change will only deplete the armed forces. Story 9. Say what now? In my country, the standards are the same. Knowledge tests and skill tests are graded the same way. We have a task-based physical fitness standard composed of timed exercises, lifts, and so on, and it applies to everyone. When physical fitness was split-tested, it was obviously unfair or biased. There is a lot of room to create a single test that is unfair, or to allow different scores, which is also unfair. If a test checks whether people are legitimately able to perform their jobs, that is reasonable. You just need to make sure you have checked for bias before administering it. Story 10. As a woman who retired from the military, I was told combat military occupational specialties would have to meet the male standard. There is no reason to require military occupational specialty 42A, a human resources specialist, to meet male standards because that job is administrative. There are not many women in the military, and those who serve are usually not in combat military occupational specialties. If the requirement is limited to only those specialties, it is manageable. If it is applied across the force, as was attempted a few years ago, many will have to leave because men and women are not the same physiologically, and women often cannot run as fast or do as many push-ups. It is an inappropriate measure of fitness for duty outside of combat roles, since most people are not running 2 miles during deployment. Either way, I am glad I am out. Hegseth is a joke. Story 11. I agree that every soldier in a combat military occupational specialty should be held to the same physical standard as a bona fide occupational qualification. I do not care if it is the old standard. I want my battle buddy to be able to get us out of trouble regardless of gender. Story 12. One of the best deck officers we ever had was a woman. She was an excellent, genuine, and effective leader who took care of everyone. One day, on her way home, there was an accident in front of her on the Coronado Bridge, and she got out to help. She was struck and killed by another vehicle. It was devastating to learn, just before our next cruise, that she would not be there. Story 13. 80% of the men in the military could not even meet the highest male standards. Recruitment is going to decrease dramatically. Story 14. If you want a real answer, ask in a military subreddit. You will only get garbage answers here from people who have never served. Story 15. One of the best non-commissioned officers I ever had the honor to serve under was a female gunnery sergeant. Story 16. I worked with several men who could not meet height or weight standards, and it was accepted. I also worked with many men who had what seemed like career-long temporary profiles. I worked with a male commander who could not qualify with his weapon. I had a male colleague promoted to a senior rank despite 3 Gomers. I witnessed a female soldier perform a fireman's carry of a 200-pound lead pusher who had been shot multiple times into an emergency room. Story 17. As a former infantryman and veteran of Operation Enduring Freedom, I don't care about your gender, sexuality, or race. Can you pull guard at 0300 after a 30-mile movement while I get some sleep? Carry me if I am hit, and lay down suppressive fire if I need to move? Can you make the split-second decision to end a life if it means saving mine? Can you carry your weight and not fall out during a movement to contact? And can you close with and engage the enemy when things get hard? Can you focus on the mission when you are short on sleep and food during a 5-day stay in the woods? Can you block out being wet and cold or hot and exhausted to complete the mission? I have seen plenty of grown men fold under that pressure. Infantry is less a physical standard than a mental one. The toughness to push on when things are difficult is what makes a good soldier. Strength matters, but I have seen men max out push-ups and sit-ups and still break under contact. And I have seen a skinny guy hump 120 pounds up and down mountains because he had the mental toughness to block out the bad and focus on the mission. I have been out for a long time, and I don't know what the army looks like now compared to when I served. War does not change, nor do the men and women who fight and suffer in it. In the end, it comes down to whether you can trust the person next to you, and that is all that really matters. Story 18. Standards should be the same for both sexes and should not be lowered or raised for either. If you meet the qualifications for the job, you should be able to perform it. Story 19. I'm not sure. I was in a combat role, injured, and reclassified into a support role in the 1990s. I didn't see or work with women in my combat role, but I did in my support role. Often, if we had heavy work to do, the men would do it, but it's a support role. If a young woman passes the initial training, then she should be in combat. If not, she couldn't because I was injured. That being said, in World War II, the 77th Infantry was made up of older folks who couldn't necessarily pass physical training but were some of the most deadly fighters in the Pacific Theater. They got the name Old Bastards. It might be a good argument for letting a few old bastards back in. Story 20. It is not male testing. It is a standard required to do the job, not a lowering of standards that could endanger others. Story 21. Plain and simple. If you cannot carry or drag a fellow soldier to safety, I do not want to serve with you in any combat role. Story 22. I was a helicopter technician in the Navy. I had no issue with women doing that job. It is mostly brain power, and on the few occasions that required heavy or brute force, there was always somebody else around to help. The issue is combat arms. There should not be separate test requirements for literal life or death jobs. You either can do it or you cannot. It does not matter what is in your pants. Story 23. They are having an increasingly difficult time finding men who qualify to serve. Story 24. As someone who has followed military policy debates for years, I think standardizing physical requirements based on job demands makes sense regardless of gender. I have served alongside women who crushed the toughest tests and men who struggled, so it is about capability, not chromosomes. If the goal is mission effectiveness and safety, then everyone should meet the same bar for combat roles. Let us ensure those standards are truly tied to real-world needs, not arbitrary barriers. Story 25. The March 31, 2025 memorandum requires that sustained physical fitness requirements for combat arms positions be sex-neutral. The services must distinguish between combat and non-combat arms occupations. Women may serve in non-combat roles and may serve in combat roles if they meet the physical fitness standard. Combat roles should have a physical standard reflecting that lower performance can endanger lives. Story 26. I served in the military for 10 years. I will tell you what the men I served with complained about most. It was not the physical standards or whether they were equal. It was that some men felt they might be tempted to sexually harass or assault us, and that it would be our fault because we were not supposed to be there in the first place. Story 27. The women with whom I served were some of the finest soldiers I knew, and the armed forces would be diminished without people of their caliber. That is all I have. Story 28. The funny thing is that they have lowered the standards so more men can pass. Story 29. It does not make sense to have different physical requirements based on gender. Either you are physically capable of doing the job or you are not. The vast majority of women who serve are probably more capable than I am. Story 30. I left the Army in 2011. I fully support the decision to standardize the physical fitness requirements. The challenges of combat do not get easier because someone has a vagina. When I was serving, the female 100.2-mile runtime would have been a failing time for a male counterpart. Story 31. In my opinion, standards should be gender-neutral and based on pass or fail. There is a lot of emphasis on physical performance in the branch I served in for promotions, promotion boards, and similar evaluations, instead of on more important factors like basic competency in a military occupational specialty. In my experience outside special operations, most roles, including combat arms, do not require a high level of physical fitness, and during a real war those standards are likely to be relaxed even further. Story 32. Honestly, a good portion of military jobs can be done by women fantastically. One of my favorite leaders on the flight line is a woman. They are usually much smarter than us cavemen at troubleshooting funky issues on a jet. However, in a combat-focused role, I can see the resistance and hesitation about lowering standards for women. Everything he said during his mission made sense, especially if we are preparing for war. Too often I deployed in place of those who were on profiles or suddenly became non-deployable. I do not agree, however, with the push of anti-beard sentiment. Story 33. As an engineer in the Navy, I advocated for strong, compact individuals who could lift and push in tight spaces. I did not care whether they were male or female. My concern was with people who were out of shape but were allowed to remain because of an obviously flawed body fat measurement system. Story 34. From what I have been able to find, this applies only to combat roles. There should be strict physical standards for everyone entering combat, including men. Any position where lives depend on physical capabilities must have such standards. Otherwise, lives are at risk. Story 35. Women have served America since the very beginning. Whether they served in uniform is immaterial. Because their service and sacrifice were never in question, I say let them continue to serve in uniform. Story 36. Two soldiers serving in the same position should be able to do their jobs at the same level. Having one soldier perform more physical labor than another is grossly unfair. If they are paid the same and receive the same benefits, they should meet the same standards. I served in a combat arms unit as a combat engineer. Can be physically demanding. Are there women who can do the job as well as or better than the average male soldier? Absolutely. If they can meet the physical standards, they should be allowed to serve. Likewise, male soldiers who cannot meet those standards should be removed. In combat, the enemy does not care whether you are male or female, and the military should not either. Create a standard and hold everyone to it. Story 37. To be honest, the leadership could not meet the male standard. I had no issue serving with lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer people or with women. I felt they had my back more than the boys from the backwoods of Alabama. They were the first to cut and run or to wet their pants when things got real, such as when we rolled over an improvised explosive device. Story 38. I did not serve in the United States military, but I served on the front line with women in Afghanistan. One of those women, Kate Nesbitt, was awarded the Military Cross, the United Kingdom's third highest honor, for running through enemy fire to give aid and save the life of a soldier who had been hit in the neck. She is 5 feet tall, but I can guarantee the men were happy to serve alongside her. Women have served in combat roles in the United Kingdom for many years without issue. Story 39. The equal physical training standards apply only to personnel in combat roles and have been in place for some time. Story 40. I served in one all-male unit and one mixed unit. I support this because you can clearly see the difference in how easy physical training is with female service members in your unit versus without. The same is true in basic training. If you do it with all males, it is harder, which it should be. The problem is we have a big performance gap between female officers and female enlisted personnel. Female officers are almost always exceptional and score similarly to male service members on physical training tests. Female enlisted personnel, on the other hand, usually score lower. By 3 years into their Army enlistment, I would estimate half are on a medical profile. By the rank of Staff Sergeant, most female service members are on a permanent medical profile. These are simply my observations. Story 41. The framing of this is incorrect. The standards for men are for combat positions, that is, infantry and artillery. The 2015 standards, he is referring to separated standards by sex. For combat roles, it makes sense to have the front line be the most fit and capable. There is nothing wrong with that. Some women meet those standards and can serve in those positions if they choose. But why assign women who cannot keep up? What benefit is there to combat units if part of the unit is unable to maintain the required pace? Story 42. Non-recent Northern European experience. At the start of basic training, when ordering gear for early exercises, simple walks in the forest lasting a few hours while carrying a rifle, a flak vest, and basic load-bearing equipment, women were given slightly different gear specifications to make their load lighter. The first time this happened, everyone formed outside the barracks and every person had the same gear on. A corporal handling the practical parts of training asked if he had listed different gear for women. A private X replied that they had heard the instructions but decided together to ignore them and wear the same gear as the others. They said they did not want the lightened gear. The corporal paused, then accepted their decision and proceeded. Later the officer asked what had happened, and the corporal explained that the privates had declined different treatment and had chosen the same equipment without slowing anything down. The officer agreed. There was no further discussion beyond that. In the following days, when other corporals started calling equipment lists by gender, that original corporal would call out that everyone should carry the same gear, stopping any separate lists. He explained that the papers had not yet been reprinted to reflect the change. Women in the unit immediately decided they did not want different treatment and did not want a situation where some people carried lighter loads. Their decision was respected and handled by themselves. Occasionally someone would carry part of another person's gear because that person was exhausted, but those were singular incidents and not gender-based. Sometimes a woman needed help, sometimes a man did. It varied by squad and moment. Training progressed by progressively increasing fitness. Many of the men were not in top physical shape at the start, while most of the women had volunteered and were highly motivated. Not every woman was super fit on entry, but they pushed through with determination. In some fitness standards, there were slightly lower numbers of push-ups required for certain ratings, and small score differences affected some selections. Those differences were minor compared with factors like motivation and how trainers assessed suitability for roles. Achieving the minimum satisfactory standard was generally not the only barrier to assignment. Trainers could take into account effort, temporary injuries, or illness, and placements were meant to bring people up to the required fitness for their roles. Special forces, combat divers, and similar units had separate selection and application processes with much higher and stricter fitness requirements. Those entry tracks were conducted independently. Story 43. Can we get someone in this conversation from a country that drafts men and women equally into the military? I hear what Hashbrown3Stacks says, and I would like to hear another country's version of how their integration of soldiers works. A similar breakdown would be a great comparison. There are physical differences that make some exercises easier for certain genders. Push-ups and pull-ups generally favor men, as do tasks requiring upper body strength. I am okay with standards matching the job. If the job requires picking up heavy objects and carrying them for miles, there should be a test. But if you are flying a drone while seated in a lounge chair in Arizona, I am less concerned about your ability to march and more concerned about your hand-eye coordination. Running a 4-minute mile does not help with that. Different tasks require different skills. You can take the entrance test, and if you pass, you may train for that job. The same applies to higher-level technical roles. You have to pass tests to operate a nuclear submarine or fly a jet. Story 44. Aspirationally, yes. It is fine so long as the standards are realistically tied to the actual work. Realistically, I am wondering where all these men with warrior physiques are coming from to fill the ranks. Given that immigration and customs enforcement pays better and is an easier job, I do not think we will fill the necessary billets without a draft. Story 45. I served in the late 1990s and early 2000s. We did not have women in my unit, but I knew people who did. If a woman can meet the standard, ruck 8 miles in under 2 hours, run 2 miles in under 16 minutes, do 42 push-ups in 2 minutes and 52 sit-ups in 2 minutes, achieve a marksman rating or better with a rifle, pass a combatives course, and remain in the field for at least 45 days without showers or facilities, then she can easily serve alongside me. The problem is that most women cannot meet those standards. At the time, physical training standards for women were lower in every category except sit-ups. We were also told that women were required to shower at least once a week in the field, whereas male infantry soldiers might get a shower once every 2 weeks or once a month. The longest I went without a shower was 60 days. I have known some very capable women soldiers who were excellent at their jobs. We had a few on staff and a couple in another troop who were light wheel mechanics, and they were among the best. I believe women can excel in many military specialties, though combat arms may be more challenging. I also believe women can make excellent pilots. Shorter, smaller people generally have a shorter distance from their heart to their brain, so they can have a slightly higher tolerance to gravitational force. Combined with a woman's naturally stronger lower body and core and her ability to focus on multiple fine tasks, this can make women excellent choices for combat pilot roles. Story 46. All I can say is that when I joined the military, I could do 42 push-ups in 2 minutes as a woman. I knew many very strong women. Men will still work alongside women. There will simply be fewer women, and selection will favor stronger women. My hope is that women are not harassed or put down for being women. Story 47. Previously in the military here, as a woman, the number of men and women who could barely pass the physical fitness test was embarrassing. It was due to obesity and a lack of physical training. I served in a branch that considered meeting the bare minimum acceptable. Story 48. No one cares about equity when you are getting shot at. The military should be about results and nothing else. Story 49. There are other militaries besides the United States that have women serving on the front line. Famously, the Soviet Union in World War II and the Israeli military today are examples where women gained extensive frontline experience. Story 50. The best non-commissioned officer I ever had was a black woman. She was a beast at physical training and could put plenty of men to shame. Inspirational, direct, no nonsense when things went wrong, but also very funny. She always had your back. The things Pete Hebegrabitic Fuckfist said today were so embarrassing. I would rather have a scarecrow in charge, not even one looking for a brain or the one from Jeepers Creepers. I mean straw stuffed into overalls on a stick. Story 51. It is dumb. As a man who was almost always able to max the physical training test, I did so because the tests measure your ability to manage your own body weight. We added dragging a 100-pound sled, a couple of kettlebells, and a deadlift, but I still could not lift and carry a 200-pound person plus equipment. If we had quantifiable evidence that female soldiers lack lethality, or could derive a link between actual lethality and physical training scores, I might be on board. But this is all based on feelings. Story 52. It's annoying to me to hear that men and women are the same and that you need to treat each other equally, but then turn around and have two separate standards for physical training, uniform, and grooming. I have lost out on more than one competition because a woman achieved a maximum physical training score while doing almost half of what I had to do to earn a maximum score. Either we admit that we are different and therefore have two separate standards, also known as being treated differently, or we say that we are the same and have one standard. You can't have it both ways. Bombs, bullets, and all other aspects of combat do not care what your gender is. Frankly, I do not care who you are as long as you can do the job. Your identity is completely irrelevant to me. Story 53. It is insulting to our veterans to claim that those who have served were unfit or given promotions they did not deserve. Story 54. My ex-wife and I were both in the military. Early in her career, she had many male supervisors who were not leaders and who constantly gave her a hard time because she was a woman. One man told her to her face that women belonged in the kitchen, not the workplace, and definitely not in the military. There were two main reasons. Those men truly believed women belonged at home, and they were embarrassed by how much better she was at the same work. After she left that hostile environment, she went on to outperform the men who had treated her poorly early on. I know many women who can outperform men at the same job when held to the same performance criteria. Men will usually do better on physical strength tests except for sit-ups, but 90% of the work in the military is not physical. It is mental, and women can meet that standard. The current push to exclude women comes from the same men who could not do their jobs better than my wife could. Story 55. As a woman, I think the military must require a minimum level of fitness and strength. It should apply standards equally rather than be gender-based, because people's lives literally depend on it. That said, basic training tests should not be as stringent as the tests for different career fields within the armed forces. A mechanic probably does not need to meet the same fitness standards as a special air service soldier. But if you want to serve in a frontline combat role, a woman should be required to meet the same standards as a man. If a male comrade is wounded and under fire and you are the only person able to save him, you should be able to carry him out as well as any man could. As a side note, there are women fighting on the front lines in Ukraine right now who could probably outperform many of the posturing, arrogant men I see complaining on Reddit about women in uniform. Story 56. I am a firefighter paramedic. We have a single fitness standard at my fire department. The job does not care if you are a man or a woman. The tasks you must perform in an emergency are the same for everyone. We cannot have people who can only perform some of the tasks simply because they are very nice. It could easily be a life or death situation. No job is a right. There is a big difference between discrimination and job standards. I would hope the military has high standards and that our fighting force is top-notch. Story 57. Job requirements are gender neutral, especially for dangerous or challenging roles. Equipment and tasks do not adjust for a person's sex. For example, heavy equipment such as 20-kilogram signal sets will not accommodate lighter shoulders. Either you can perform the required task safely, or you cannot. If someone who cannot perform the tasks is placed in the role, they endanger themselves and may put colleagues at risk by requiring rescue or diverting attention from other duties. Story 58. Absolutely on board. It should not be based on gender. It should be based on the expectations of the job and a minimum readiness to deploy immediately to the front lines. Story 59. I was an Air Wing Marine in a non-combat role and still think that uniform standards, regardless of gender, are the way to go. My job involved lifting heavy aircraft weapon systems, bombs, rockets, and so on. I did not care about your gender. I only cared that you could physically help. Otherwise, it became an extra burden on others. Story 60. But honestly, the testing is superficial anyway. I weighed 98 pounds when I entered the military and still had to haul those 5-gallon paint drums on working parties. It did not matter what your physical measurements were, you were expected to get it done. Story 61. This is not male testing. It is military testing. Story 62. I have mixed feelings about it. Every role has the potential to become a combat role. In Iraq, even support personnel ran security on convoys at times. Having women meet the same standards is a good thing if we are purely looking at combat capabilities. However, it is hard enough to get the right people into the right jobs these days. I left in 2018. It was bad then, and the situation has only deteriorated since. Recruitment has not been great in the last few years and, with few exceptions, has followed a consistent downward trend. Having more personnel is a good thing, and if that means different standards, it may require the pragmatic choice to compromise and do what is best in the long term. Story 63. I am currently in the Navy, so I am unsure how this will affect us because I do not know which rates they consider combat under the gender-neutral policy. Most of us on ships are not in combat roles. Either way, the requirements, even for men, are not that high. Compared with other branches, our standards are not very strenuous. Story 64. He held to the highest standards. If you are a cook, you will still be expected to maintain physical fitness, but not at the highest level. I appreciate that all senior leaders now need to qualify in physical training and on the weapons range. This is important for those in combat-ready positions. Story 65. Former infantry marine from around 2015. Most of my buddies re-enlisted after their 4-year stints, and a few are still in. I saw all sorts of things in service where men who did not meet the standard were pushed through. During the School of Infantry, we had a very skinny man of about 5 feet tall pushed through the schoolhouse. To graduate, I do not recall him ever completing the 3 to 4 hikes required for graduation, let alone operating the 19 Malawian Kwacha's grenade launcher, completing the bench press, or performing the dummy drag. My company at the School of Infantry was the test company for new physical standards. At the time, the Marine Corps was resisting integration of females into infantry roles, so we were given various physical fitness tests intended to screen out females. The tests achieved that, but they also eliminated many men. I agree with Pete's speech about the military. It is not games. The military exists to win wars, and if you cannot physically meet the highest male standard, you do not belong in the military. Nothing personal against females, but standards should not be lowered just to allow females in. That is how people get killed. On the battlefield, you have to trust the people at your side, and if people enter with lower standards, no one will trust them. For reference, I am an Asian male. Story 66. Some jobs require exacting physical standards, while many others are adequately served by a basic standard. The problem arises in armed conflict with a peer, or when people who meet only basic standards must defend themselves or carry heavy equipment across difficult terrain. For example, I do not believe the Air Force fitness test standards, when merely met, guarantee that a woman can perform those tasks. I also do not believe a man who only meets those standards would be able to perform them. Physical fitness testing is generally a baseline measurement for medical and insurance purposes. Organizations may say it provides commanders with a snapshot of who is deployable and mission-ready, but a scrawny person is unlikely to do well in most of those situations. There was a huge difference between what I could do at 135 pounds and at 150 pounds when carrying a kit. Story 67. If they are going to insist that generals and admirals be physically fit, it seems the commander-in-chief of the United States military should be too. Story 68. The idea of sex-based testing is nonsense. Testing should be role-based. This proposal is not about operational effectiveness. It is about reducing opportunities for women. Story 69. Physical requirements for combat roles are different from those for, say, a clerk or a loadmaster. Hegseth said yesterday that there should be no relaxed standards. Anyone in a combat role must be able to perform the same tasks regardless of gender, including grabbing an injured soldier by the back of their vest and dragging them, or lifting and carrying them. Story 70. Pete Hegseth has no business being in the position he holds. That is how I feel about the leadership. Story 71. I served as a Marine Corps officer. That is exactly how it should be. We have several highly capable women who will still meet the standards. However, we need to prioritize keeping troops safe and effective over female representation in all roles. Story 72. Too many people, boomers, and degenerates who never served are running their mouths about women. The female Marines in my previous units were warfighters who could shoot, maneuver, and fight like the rest of us. Experiences may vary, but in my experience, female Marines are as capable and determined as any of their colleagues. Story 73. From the Air Force side, when I served from 2010 to 2016, many women did not actually pass the push-up portion of the female physical fitness test standards. Their form was not good enough to qualify for the repetitions, but proctors counted them as passing. Having different physical fitness standards for men and women in the same job is not really equal. If I need to send people out on a mission that may be physically exhausting, why would I want someone in my group who is held to a lower standard and may not be able to keep up? Story 74. I was a Marine Corps infantryman from 2006 to 2010, with 2 deployments to Iraq and 1 to the West African coast. Some women belong in combat arms, some belong in support roles, and some have no business there. I could say the same about men. However, combat arms should have a single universal standard. It is specifically physical in nature and extremely demanding, even on strong bodies. Failure to pull your own weight can result in the deaths of others. Anything introduced to combat arms that does not make them better at killing people or that does not add to unit cohesion should not be considered. Story 75. Any job, anywhere, should have clear standards for performance that apply to everyone. If a person can perform the job, they should be hired. If not, they should not. Standards should not be artificial or arbitrary. Clear, consistent standards will help eliminate discrimination. Story 76. Assuming you are American. This is not the case in Canada. There is one standard and no issues serving alongside or under female soldiers. Story 77. Okay, I'm going to take advantage of the relative anonymity Reddit offers and give you the really honest, long take I would not give in person. I'll start with my bona fides. I served 10 years in Army combat arms. The last job I held was Special Forces Weapons Sergeant. Before that, I was a team leader in infantry rifle companies with the 75th Ranger Regiment and the 101st Airborne. I have a few deployments under my belt, but not nearly as many as those who served in the global war on terrorism. Caveats. I have been out nearly as long as I was in, and organizational culture can change a lot in a decade. I was enlisted, which means more experience in the field but less of a bird's eye view of operations. I only know about things within the scope of my job. I do not want to devalue the service of anyone of any gender who served in the United States military. Lots of women saw combat, some in situations more intense than anything I saw. For those who did not, every job is important and deserving of recognition. In asymmetric warfare, there is no such thing as a true rear echelon troop. There are factors for and against integrating women into combat arms jobs. I will lay out the most pressing ones I can think of. Against, generally, the force did not want it. Reasons differ by who you ask, but one big reason was that no one serving in a line infantry platoon was asking for it. When this policy was announced, infantry platoons were still deeply engaged in the Afghanistan war, maintaining the train-deploy-reset cycle while trying not to burn out soldiers and trying to remove those who did not meet standards. That last bit is important and few civilians understand it. It is hard to kick soldiers out of the army, even really poor performers. Leaders must build a packet documenting a consistent pattern of substandard performance. It is subject to review and appeal. Typically, unless someone has committed an egregious offense, it can take 6 months or longer to get someone discharged. That is a massive drain on leaders' time, so that course of action is usually reserved for people who are actively draining morale and readiness. Lesser problem soldiers are moved off the line to the company arms room or supply. That also sucks because line platoons get worse support than if competent people filled those roles. Summary release authority, that is the ability to remove people without red tape, was one reason I was attracted to special operations. If units had first been allowed to shed their existing chaff, the rank and file might have been more receptive to integrating women. Another factor in the resistance was how the change was presented to the American public. In many circles it was rolled out as women have already been doing this, so it is just a matter of recognizing their work. The problem with that is contact is not the same as being an infantryman. It is a rough, unglamorous, dirty job that takes a toll on long-term health. Its defining feature is carrying heavy loads for long distances. On deployments, infantry units went out daily looking to engage the enemy and, when they found it, were expected to close and finish the fight. They were tasked with setting up combat outposts in remote valleys and fending for themselves. To hear so many people equate that with mounted contact or indirect fire on resupply missions to major bases was a hard pill to swallow. This was felt in the Special Operations Forces community too. One justification for allowing women in Special Operations Forces was female engagement teams. The argument was that these women were already taking part in counterterrorism raids and that it was time to recognize their work. I worked with female engagement teams several times and oversaw some of their training, which was usually a few weeks of solid shooting instruction and basic close-quarters battle. On missions, they were there to talk to women on the objective after, and only after it had been secured. They stayed on the trucks until everyone on the objective had been restrained. So it was hard to hear that people who received a short, non-qualifying course had already been doing our jobs. Edit. Especially after watching candidates go through 2 years of selection and the Special Forces qualification course, where you see extraordinary people fail to finish because of injury or bad luck. To hear "been there, done that" from people who had only received a brief crash course left a bad taste for many of us. 4. The main factor in favor is that we are a democracy where the military is subordinate to civilian authority, and the American people mostly supported this change. That, to me, trumps other concerns. The force is built to adapt, and this is not the biggest challenge it has faced. Overall, there is value in casting a wide net to find the best talent. There are women who would be standouts in an infantry platoon, but the concern has been that line units have struggled to maintain existing standards with existing personnel. The Department of Defense introduced a new variable without addressing that problem and told leaders to make it work. Edit. I was remiss in mentioning another driver of this change: female officers. They had a legitimate complaint. In field grade and general officer ranks, it is very hard to stand out against peers who have combat command if you do not. This was a top-down initiative driven by people who did not want top-tier female officers overlooked for the best jobs. I cannot fault them for that. What it was not driven by was platoon sergeants saying, "We would be winning this war if I just had a few women in the squads." To overlook either perspective is dishonest. I also think there is potentially intrinsic value women can bring to combat jobs. Because they have different life experiences, they sometimes see solutions that are not obvious to men. It is not a matter of gendered solutions. Women sometimes notice things men do not, and vice versa. There can be real value in adding that different set of eyes on patrol. Can be a win-win if the right leaders can find it. I worked with a female civil affairs officer who absolutely earned her keep, and the whole operational detachment alpha was glad to have her. The Department of the Army should examine feedback from those interactions for examples of value added. Story 78. I was a mechanic in the Air Force. The shop had about 80 people. 12 of them were women. They worked as hard as the men. Only one was a slacker. The best welders in the shop were women. Story 79. It should not be controversial that, to serve in a combat role, you must meet the standards for that role. That this is controversial shows that an overhaul of the warrior culture is needed. When did the military become focused on feelings and participation trophies? Story 80. I think certain roles should have specific requirements. For example, a fighter pilot should have good visual acuity and normal color vision. Some roles might require lifting a specified weight or passing a certain level of fitness, similar to a police officer. Other roles might have no physical requirements. Story 81. Pete Hegseth is a drunken idiot who does not know the first thing about leadership and is desperately trying to look cool, which is why he keeps trying to hang out or do physical training with elite units. That is the closest he would ever get to one, since there is no way he would have met the standards to serve in one. He was a poor officer, as evident from his awards and decorations, and an even worse Secretary of Defense. Combat units should have a higher physical fitness and marksmanship threshold for anyone who wants to be in them. This applies to all genders. Anyone who meets the standard should be able to join, but they must meet the standard, and that standard should be higher than for non-combat units. We already have a higher set of standards for elite units, and I would not mind having them for regular infantry, scouts, and similar units as well. We could arguably lower standards for many jobs that are essentially 9-to-5 desk jobs, because they do not require running or doing push-ups. I know the military will not do that, but the principle goes both ways. Promotions in combat units should not be decided by sitting in front of a review board and reciting what the field manual says about field sanitation while wearing your classy uniform. They should be based on demonstrated ability to lead a team, squad, or platoon in a combat environment. Awards should not be upgraded or downgraded based on rank either. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.